Hey, what's up, Sonic Academy? P-LASK here. I make music and sounds as P-LASK, and I'm also an Ableton certified trainer. And I've been teaching for many years and worked with many students in many different studios. And one of the things that I've noticed is that people tend to make a lot of mistakes when it comes to basses, and that's what I wanted to design this course about, this bass theory course. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the different categorizations of bass sounds. I have two in particular that I like to use, which I call sub basses and tonal basses, or some people might call these mid basses. So I want to talk about what those are, what functions they serve in a track and in a mix. And then we'll also spend a good chunk of this course going through and synthesizing some common bass sounds that, at the very least, these will serve as foundations of bass sounds that you can expand out and use in all different genres of music. So again, these are common bass sounds that I hear in a lot of different types of music. I use them a lot in my own music as well. And when we create these sounds, I'll try to call out areas where we can either tweak a particular parameter or maybe set up a macro for automation later on, so that you can further modify and morph these sounds to really make them your own. So sit back, relax, let's kick things off by talking about the difference between sub and tonal basses, and I'll catch you in the next video. Let's just look and listen to a couple of quick examples of a sub bass and a tonal bass. So when I think of sub basses, I think of things that are meant to carry weight in the mix, to kind of add low-end weight to the track, to fill out the low end of the frequency spectrum. Generally, they're going to be playing parts that are a bit simpler. They're not going to be playing really dense melodies or hooky, things that are going to get stuck in the listener's head. Not so much the forte of a sub bass. Whereas tonal basses are going to do the opposite. They're there to be maybe more melodic, to be a little bit more present in the mix, maybe fill out some of the mid-range, the low mids, not so much carrying weight in the low end like a sub bass might be doing. So here's a quick example. This is a drum and bass track I started working on recently, and I'm using a pretty prominent sub bass here. So let's take a quick listen to this. Bass is coming from ANA 2, and we'll get into synthesizing this bass later on. But you can see in the spectrum analyzer I've added, most of the energy here is happening down below 100 Hertz. We have a nice tall fundamental of, the notes that I'm playing on the keyboard are represented by that fundamental. We do have some harmonic content above that, but it's not very dense. There's not a lot of energy there. Anything that's there is probably coming from some sort of distortion or wave shaping I did to just add some presence to the sound. So this is primarily functioning as a sub bass, carrying weight in the low end. If we look at the MIDI clip too, it's not doing anything melodically complex. It's very simple. It's not really even playing very regularly. It's just there to kind of work in around the beats. Because I've already got a kick drum down here. There is a kick in this amen break that I'm using, but I think I high passed that. Yeah, just to leave room for my kick and my sub bass. So it's there just to carry weight, right? Not really doing anything melodically dense, not really adding a lot to the mid-range or the tone of the sound. I've got pads and I got vocals and other things that are doing that. So let's take another look at another example here. This is a synthwave track I'm working on, and here I have a better example of a tonal bass. Something that's not so much there to add sub to the sound. So let's play. I've already got some clips fired up here. Let's just hit play and see what it sounds like. So here's our bass. Here we have a bass coming from Ableton's wavetable synth. I'm using two oscillators here, and these are both wavetable oscillators. So the more complex looking the waveforms are, generally the more harmonic content you're going to get in the sound. And if we look at the spectrum analyzer here, we can see that represented. So I've got a lot of energy here in the mid-range between 100 Hertz and 1 kilohertz. And I do have a strong fundamental, and so therefore there is some sub to this sound, but that's not really its strong point. It's here to harmonize with the lead. Let me close this down for a minute. Let me solo the bass with the lead. You can hear how they're kind of working together. It's there to harmonize with the lead and support it and do something more melodic and stand out more in the mix. It's not there so much to add weight, although it is kind of serving that function. So here it's kind of straddling both worlds of adding some sub, adding some low end to the mix, but really standing out in the low mids and supporting that lead and the pad and other things that I've got going on here. Let's bring the pad in as well. This will be the breakdown of the track probably. Okay, so just to reiterate, Sub basses, they're to add weight. They're there to fill out the low end. They're going to be playing more simple bass lines. You're going to have simpler melodic parts. Whereas tonal basses are going to fill out maybe the low mids, maybe some of the mid range of the track. They're meant to be a little bit more hooky, a little bit more memorable, stand out a little bit more. And I've heard some tracks where the bass is acting almost like the main lead, or in other cases, they're going to support the lead or the chords or other parts of the track by doing something a little bit more melodically or harmonically rich or complex. They're not going to be quite as simple as a sub bass might be. So I hope that distinction makes sense. We'll dive into specific frequency spaces for where these things kind of fall in the next video, and then we'll start looking at synthesizing some of these different types of bass sounds. So to get things started, I've loaded a default instance of Ableton's operator synth just because the default preset here is simply a sine wave. I've turned the volume up a little bit. I think it defaults to -18. I just brought it up to -6 since I'm only really going to be playing one note at a time. And I'm also going to grab the default preset for Ableton's Spectrum Analyzer. We can find that under Audio Effects, Utilities, Spectrum. We'll load that in. If you have like Voxengo Span or Melda Productions, what is it called, M Analyzer or whatever, if you have one of those plugins and want to use that to follow along, if you're using a different DAW, that's totally fine. I'm just going to stick with stock things here for now. So if we're looking at the Spectrum Analyzer, although before we get into this, actually, I want to make a couple quick changes here to the default preset because it's a little hard to read. If you play a note and then you let go of it, it does this thing where it scales the volume down like crazy. So we're getting down to like -180. And even when you're playing stuff, it kind of stretches and skews this y-axis here. So to prevent that from happening, I'm going to turn off the auto scaling. I'm going to set the maximum volume that it'll kind of keep at the top of the graph here to 6 dB, and then we'll set the minimum to like, let's do -60. Because once we get below -60, things start to get really quiet and they're not really present in the song that much anymore. I'm also going to turn this graph max function off. That just kind of hides this ghost version of the last note that I played. You can turn that on if you want to, if that helps, but I'm going to leave it off for now. And then also this block setting, we're going to increase that to 16,384. That's going to give us a little bit more accuracy. It's basically going to make all the harmonic readouts a little more narrow, not quite as wide, so they'll be a little bit more accurate at reading the frequencies. So if I play different notes here, I'm just playing a sine wave. So, you know, we're just seeing a single fundamental frequency. And you can hear I'm playing around this like C2 octave range. And I'm above 100 hertz, right? This is a sine wave. It's fine, whatever, but it doesn't sound subby at all. If we start to go below 100 hertz, start to cross that threshold, I got to bring my keyboard down another octave. Oops, too high. Okay, now we start to feel the low end, right? We start to feel that subbiness, and make sure you're listening on good speakers or good headphones, right? So technically speaking, or I guess I should say broadly speaking, if we're looking at 100 hertz down to about 30-ish hertz, once we get below 30 hertz, it's technically still like sub basses. We get into like sub harmonics and things like that, but that's really hard to hear for most people. So from 100 down to about 30 hertz, so if we're looking at this line here, that's already marked off as 100, down to this line here, which is marked off as 30. By the way, I can tell that because when I point to different spaces on the graph here, you see this little blue box telling me the frequency that I'm pointing at. So 30 hertz is right around here. But if we wanted to narrow this down and really talk about effective sub basses, most effective sub basses are going to fall somewhere between this line here, 40 hertz, which you can see is like a low E, F kind of a note. If we get up to like 43, 42, we get to F. Up to roughly 80 hertz, so this line around here, and even 80 hertz is kind of pushing it a little high. Doesn't sound too bad, but once we get right around there, what am I at? D sharp, E, we start to leave that sub place and go into that more tonal place where it doesn't carry as much weight, right? If you've ever heard a really effective sub bass in a song, it's fallen somewhere within this window on the frequency spectrum analyzer here. And that might not look like a very broad space to work in, right? But it does cover a full octave. 40 to 80 hertz is a full octave. So that is technically every note on the keyboard. You get one of every note on the keyboard. So you could write in any key that you want to. So this will hopefully help some of you avoid the mishap, especially you bass music producers out there. I always hear you guys say, write everything in F, right? Write everything in F major, F minor, because F, the root note, it resonates right here, right around 42, 43 hertz. And that's kind of this low threshold of where sub bass can sound really effective. And I get that, but don't restrict yourself in your musicality and your creativity to only write things in one scale ever. You've got a good range to work in here. But you can hear, just again, playing a sine wave in that range. Sometimes a simple sine wave is all you need for a good effective sub bass. And then when we're talking about tonal basses, again, broadly speaking, I'm talking about things above 100 hertz or bass sounds that have a lot of harmonic content in this area above 100 hertz, primarily between 100 and 1 kilohertz, broadly speaking. If you remember the tonal bass example that I played over here in the synthwave track, if we were looking at the spectrum analyzer again, now that we've demarcated those zones, you can see there is a sub frequency here. We do have a strong fundamental, which is sort of floating around between 50 hertz and 80 hertz. But most of the energy here is coming from, most of the presence to the sound is coming from this mid-range, low mids. That's where a lot of the body of the sound is coming from. And so therefore it's more tonally present, right? By tone, I mean the timbre of the sound or the harmonics that are present in the sound. I like to use the word tonal basses because I'm talking about sounds that have a lot of harmonic content to them. And so therefore it can be a little bit more melodic in what it's doing or how it's functioning in your song. Like I said, with this track, this is here to support the lead and the pads and other things. It's not just there to be a pure sub thing and hold the low end weight in my mix. I've got other things that are doing that. I've got a kick drum, but even the fundamental here might be enough to fill out the low end, even spots of the song when I arrange this when the kick drum isn't playing, right? So I guess this brings up another point too, which is that I always see people, and I've worked with many producers, I've worked with so many students over my years of teaching, I see so many people make the mistake of finding a really great bass like this. Like this is a good little one-stop shop for a bass preset here. It's got decent sub, it's got a lot of nice tone to it, it's a versatile sound. I can do a lot with it. I can play more melodic parts, I could treat it as more of a sub bass, maybe if I EQ'd that out or filtered out that top end stuff. But I see a lot of people do this thing where they'll find a great bass preset and they'll immediately high pass it because they need to add a sub underneath it. And what I'm trying to say here is before you just automatically do that, because YouTube University tells you to do that, and I'm contributing to YouTube University a little bit here, I'll admit, but YouTube University has told people, yeah, add a sub bass all the time. But what I'm saying is just pause for a minute, look at your bass sound under a spectrum analyzer, listen to your bass sound. Does it have some nice strong sub presence to it? This bass sound, I think, does. So this would be a great example of something that I'm not just going to automatically high pass this just to add in a sub bass just because. This has sub bass present in the sound. And it's also got this nice tonality to it of all these harmonics. Now, of course, there might be situations where you want to have a separate sub bass on a separate channel to process that differently. That's a different story, right? But don't fall into this trap of finding a great bass preset and then just automatically high passing it because you feel like you need to add a sub bass just because somebody else told you to do that and they didn't even have a good reason why. So I hope that that makes sense, this kind of line of demarcation, if you wanted to just broadly accept it here with me as 100 hertz. Things below 100 hertz tend to be more sub. Things above that tend to be more tone. If you have basses that have more energy up here, I would consider them tonal basses. Basses with more energy focused down here, I'd consider them sub basses. Sub basses tend to play more simple parts, not as dense melodically, the things that they're doing in tracks. Whereas tonal basses, you got a little bit more flexibility. And the last point, just to summarize everything here, is that sometimes you might find a good tonal bass patch or make a good tonal bass patch that might have some good low end to it, might have some good sub. So therefore, you don't need to necessarily automatically high pass a tonal bass and just add a separate sub just because. So let's move on and start to synthesize some common bass sounds, and we'll look at some functions and uses of how you can utilize them in your own production.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate all the support from you guys. If you love this video, then smash a like, and if you want to be notified about new videos, hit the subscribe and notification buttons.